Hi, I'm Josh McDonald.
And I'm Miranda and we are Hand Therapy Academy.
Let's talk about splinting. Everyone has their favorites, or more importantly, maybe their least favorite splints. So we're going to talk about some of ours and why there are favorites or least favorites. So let's talk about least favorites first. Miranda, what's your least favorite splint to make?
Oh gosh, I think one that I don't really love making is the Munster splint. So that would be one of my least favorites. And I think it's one of my least favorites because I hate when splints have to go around the thumb, like a radial gutter or a Munster, where you're creating that hole and then you're trying not to get it to rub on there in that first web space. So that's definitely my least favorite. And if I would hate to wear it as a patient, and probably next to that would be making a Sarmiento brace.
Yeah, Sarmiento is an interesting one. It's a tough, just the strapping, I feel like I don't mind making the curvature around the shoulder. The internal cuff piece is fine, but finding a way to strap that thing to keep it on and keep it secure, I feel like you're kind of fighting against yourself a lot.
Yeah. And then, trying to get everything to attach and make sure the patient maintains their precautions is not fun. And I think, either a Munster or a Sarmiento would definitely be my least favorite. What about you? What's your...
So I think for similar reasons, I was going to say radial gutter for the hand because we talked about cutting around the thumb. I think more the ulnar gutter, hand-based ulnar gutter. And I think more so, especially with smaller hands, you just end up with a lot of really tight corners. Cutting around like at the distal end around the fingers, lots of little tight cuts around there and down in the distal palmar crease and trying to create that, make it comfortable, but still enough support to hold the, if it's a fourth metacarpal, giving it enough dorsal support. And so like there's a lot of tight corners to work around there. The stretch and tag does a good job of making it conform easily, but then depending on what material you're using, if it's trying to get it cut without jagged, if it's perforated and then edging and all the tight corners makes it tricky. And I think we mentioned this in one of our other podcasts. I think a mallet splint that has to have a swan neck component to it. So if you're doing like we do this little figure 8 that starts volar and these two little halves of the strip lay over dorsally and then they travel proximally. Or if I'm trying to do a normal mallet and an oval 8, and it's just really tricky to manage all of that, especially if you've got to manage your mallet precautions at the same time. Especially if it's a one-piece unit you're trying to do, it is tough to get that on, and you're just bound to end up with that DIP dropping into flexion at some point if they're trying to do it by themselves one-handed.
Yeah, that's definitely one of my least favorites as well. Totally agree with that one. And then what are some of your... Oh, one thing I thought about when you were talking too was I remember when we used to work with that large group of hand surgeons, and I remember one of the surgeons always telling me, like, I'll never order a hand-based because they're so uncomfortable. So if he was going to do a hand-based ulnar gutter, he would always prefer that we make it forearm-based. Do you think you as a patient, would you rather have your wrist included or your wrist free in terms of comfort?
Oh, I'd for sure rather have the wrist free. If it's allowed by precautions, I feel like the stiffness of the wrist and just the immobilization of it, I'd much rather have it free. I feel like there's a lot of ways to stay out of impingement zones, even if you're going to lightly flare the proximal edge around the wrist, just to give you a little bit more freedom of movement. I'd much rather have the hand-based. How about you?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't, being someone that hasn't worn a splint, knock on wood, for very long, I think I get the idea of why, because it wouldn't slide around. If your wrist is included, it kind of anchors it down and it doesn't slide around. So you probably have a little bit more comfort in terms of that. And so I don't know. I guess I think I would need to try it. And I don't want to try it.
You haven't been willing to commit to that.
Yeah, I'm not committed to that yet.
Yeah. I'm curious on the Munster. Let's go back to when you said the Munster. It was about the thumb hole was the part that you disliked. Does the rest of the fabrication of a Munster hang you up at all? Like the tabs and the draping of it, does that kind of slow you down at all?
No, I don't think so because, you're draping with gravity. So I think that's like the easy part. You're just laying it on top and tagging it on the bottom and tagging it around the back. So that doesn't seem to really touch me up. It's just that part with the end because I see when patients come back, that's what they come back for is that web space. So, sometimes I'll put padding there, but then I'm like, well, that's not going to last that long or,
Yeah. Yeah. I've tried a variety of different kinds of padding. And in that first web space, the padding just doesn't stay well. If it's padding on a strap or padding on a rigid piece of thermoplastic there, it's just a high traffic area for like contact. So it's just bound to come off. I feel like, and sometimes I'll send them with extra pieces to say like, hey, just stick this on when you need it. You know, when the other one falls off, stick this one on in its place.
And they need it, right? You have to have that component in the first web space. I mean, unless you can find another way to secure it, but you are blocking forearm rotation. So you really need some
Yeah.
support there.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's talk favorites. What splint do you like to make? What splint's your favorite?
My favorite is probably the type of wrist support we make, which is an ulnar-based wrist support, and that goes high on the volar and dorsal side. So you're strapping it, you know, on the radial side of the hand. So it gives you a lot of good support. We make them a lot for a CT, carpal tunnel, wrist fractures, wrist tendonitis, all those things. It's kind of my go-to. I think it's comfortable. Patients rarely come back with problems, and I feel like I can do it in, 5 minutes and you're in and out.
Yeah, that's a much quicker one. And the volar version of a wrist cock up, that is the alternative to what we're making on an ulnar based. I feel like every time I made one of those, before I started making the ulnar based, I'd have patients come back complaining about that bar that travels around the first web space and it's load through the soft tissues, or that second metacarpal head, or there's that bar is just uncomfortable, and this doesn't have that. It's a soft strap instead. So I agree. That's a good alternate splint to make for that.
Yeah, and it's very versatile, right? It can do a lot of things. So if they need a splint later because they develop carpal tunnel, that's your splint. It's easy to wear. It's easy to sleep in.
Serves a lot of good purposes. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I think my favorite to make is a yoke splint. I feel like that's another one that serves a bunch of purposes, is super quick to make, whether you want to make it out of Orthocast or you're making it out of thermoplastic. It's great for a lot of those zone 4 through 7 extensor tendon injuries. If they're not a polytrauma, it gives you a lot of mobility and keeps them safe. And patients come in wearing this giant, bulky postoperative dressing, and you send them out with this little thing that goes between their fingers, and they're just elated. It's like, are you sure this is safe? I'm like, absolutely. And it's funny you mentioned you not being willing to wear a splint to test it out. The first time I heard about, I think it was at one of the hand surgeons conferences, I heard that Dr. Merritt, I forget which one does but he was talking about it. I'm like, I think it's going to fall off. For sure it's going to fall off. So I made a yoke splint for myself and wore it for like a week. I'm like, this thing's bound to fall off while I'm sleeping, all these, and it didn't. It stayed on the whole time. And I was even like shaking it every once in a while. And so I was thrilled with it. Like, hey, this is a super low profile way to give them the precautions that they need. And now they're finding it's great for a whole bunch of other stuff. PIP contractures, possibly even flexor tendon stuff, although that's way early in the studies yet. So I like making it super quick, just a matter of not impinging on those web spaces, but otherwise it's a super quick splint to make.
Yeah. And I think, you make it seem really easy. I don't think it's that easy of a splint. And I have lots of students that struggle with that one. And so I think you just have to practice. Like for me anyways, that one took a lot of practice for me to get it down where patients liked wearing it. And I used to make them 2 or 3 just to, see which one they liked the best, and it gave me more practice. And usually it's made out of a scrap piece of material. So
yeah, that's another reason why I like it, because I'm using all those little scraps left around. It's like, hey, I can use this thing. I can use it now. And I find that the larger patients need it out of 1/8-inch thermoplastic, and I'll use a non-perforated material. But smaller or medium-sized patients, I'll take Orthocast and double it up. And that's usually just enough bulk to hold them, as long as I give a good differential in positioning and not let it kind of sneak down a little bit. It holds them just fine. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think a funny story was when Josh and I both worked for the hand surgeon group. I remember I had this patient and we ended up branching out on our own. But this patient had seen Josh in our Phoenix clinic, but she didn't want to drive all the way to West Valley to see Josh. And he had made her a relative motion splint or a yoke splint, and she loved it. And so every time that patient still sees me, I see her every year I make her an RMO, but it took me forever to like get it to where it was up to like how she was always like, well, Josh just did it so fast on his first time. And so she always reminded me of that. So I think that's another reason why it just kind of makes me laugh when I think about those. Cause
maybe now it's your least favorite splint, because every time it comes up, you think, stupid Josh.
Yeah, Josh made it so well. And then I was always trying to live up to the one that Josh made her first.
And I guarantee if I made her a second one, it wouldn't have come close to the first.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but
sometimes you make a splint and it's just like, oh, great, perfect, it worked. And they're happy, send them out the door, and they think it's great. And you're like, I have no idea how that happened, but I'll take it. It's a win.
Yeah, no, she loved it, and we still laugh about it. So.
That's funny. That's funny.
Yeah.
Well, share with us in the comments what your favorite or least favorite splint is and why, and maybe what you do to kind of work around it. And if you have any questions for us, feel free to reach out. info@handtherapyacademy.com is our email, or on our social media platforms at Hand Therapy Academy.